Get up, girl, the officer growled, his voice cutting through the crisp afternoon air like a slap. His uniform gleamed in the sunlight, a symbol of authority warped by the sneer curling his lips. Children's laughter filled the park moments before but now faded into an uneasy silence. A 13-year-old girl froze, clutching her sketchbook to her chest, her wide eyes staring up at him. "I didn't do anything," she stammered, her voice soft but firm. The officer took a step closer, the hard soles of his boots crunching against the gravel path. "You think you can just sit here and act like you belong?" His gaze was sharp, predatory, narrowing on her dark skin as if it alone was an offense. Her friends, gathered nearby, stood paralyzed, whispering among themselves but too afraid to intervene. The girl's fingers tightened around her book, knuckles pale, her quiet strength refusing to buckle. "You hear me, girl?" His tone sharpened. "Get up." "I'm just drawing," she said, her voice quivering yet defiant. "I didn't break any rules." The officer scoffed, reaching for the cigarette perched between his fingers. With deliberate cruelty, he flicked the ash toward her. "Rules? You don't need to break any rules. You just need to learn your place." She gasped as the burning cigarette came closer to her arm, the ember threatening, daring her to react. "Stop," she cried out, stumbling back as heat licked at her skin. Her voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes, not just from the pain but from the humiliation, the raw injustice of it all. Around them, a small crowd began to form, some pulling out their phones, others whispering angrily. But no one stepped forward. "Not yet." "You're pathetic," the officer muttered, taking another drag from his cigarette as if nothing had happened. "People like you think you can do whatever you want. Not on my watch." And then a voice, sharp and commanding, sliced through the tension. "What the hell are you doing to my daughter?" The crowd turned. A man, his tailored suit incongruous against the backdrop of the park, stormed toward the scene. His steps were measured, but his eyes burned with fury. He exuded authority, his presence sending ripples of unease through the onlookers, and the officer. The officer straightened slightly, the arrogance in his stance faltering. "Sir, this isn't, don't you dare, sir, me," the man cut him off, his voice rising. "I saw what you did. You assaulted her." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't just of pain. They were of relief, hope. She wasn't alone. The officer's face twitched, trying to regain control of the situation. "I was just keeping the peace," he said, his tone slipping into defensiveness. "Keeping the peace," the man spat. His words were a loaded weapon, fired with precision. "You humiliated a child. You burned her skin. On what grounds?" "Because she was sitting in a public park with a sketchbook." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd now emboldened, their phones still recording, capturing every moment. "You'll regret this," the officer hissed under his breath, his eyes darting between the father and the growing crowd. "No," the man said coldly, his tone like ice, dangerous and unyielding. "You will." The officer tried to step back, but the man followed him, his towering presence unrelenting. "You think a badge gives you the right to do whatever you want? You picked the wrong child today. You picked the wrong family." The girl's father turned to the onlookers, his voice commanding. "You all saw it. You all recorded it. Don't let this man hide behind his uniform. What he did was a crime." The officer stumbled, his arrogance crumbling under the weight of the father's words. His hand went instinctively to the badge pinned to his chest, as if it could shield him from the reckoning barreling toward him. The father knelt beside his daughter, his voice softening for the first time. "Are you okay?" he asked, gently touching her shoulder. She nodded, her lips pressed tightly together, though tears streaked her face. "I'll make this right," he promised, standing tall once more. His gaze locked onto the officers, unyielding. "You've done enough harm. Now, I'll show you what justice looks like." The officer's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, the reality of the situation finally settling in. And yet, this was just the beginning. The man wasn't just any father. He was an attorney. A relentless one. And what happened that day in the park was about to set off a chain of events that would expose more than just one officer's cruelty. What secrets would unravel in the days to come? How far would a father go to protect his child and bring accountability to a system that let people like this officer thrive? And what price would the officer pay when he realized he had picked the wrong battle? Stay with us to find out. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. We believe in equality, justice, and the dignity of every individual. To our black viewers and everyone fighting against discrimination, you matter, your voice matters, and your story matters. Thank you for trusting us with your time today. Get ready for a powerful story, and if you enjoy what we do, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join our community. Let's keep sharing stories that spark change. Enjoy the story. The day began like any other for Tasha Bennett. The 13-year-old loved mornings in her neighborhood park, a small pocket of serenity amidst the buzz of the city. Nestled between apartment buildings and a busy street, the park was her sanctuary. She often spent hours on one of its wooden benches, sketchbook balanced on her knees, pencil in hand. Her creativity seemed to bloom in the open air, away from the pressures of her middle school life, where fitting in felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Tasha was quiet but observant. She had her mother's thoughtful eyes and her father's stubborn resolve. Her world revolved around her family, especially her father, David Bennett, a respected attorney in the community. David's reputation wasn't built on his courtroom victories alone but on his unwavering commitment to justice, especially for those who couldn't defend themselves. Tasha admired him deeply, even if she didn't fully understand the weight of his work. That morning, David had left early for a meeting. Tasha's mother, Angela, a nurse with endless patience, was on the night shift and sleeping upstairs. It was a routine Saturday. The sun was out, and the breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Tasha packed her pencils and sketchbook into her backpack and told her mom she'd be back before lunch. The park was alive with activity. Children played tag, couples strolled hand in hand, and elderly neighbors sat chatting on the benches. Tasha found her usual spot under a sprawling oak tree, where she could see everything but remain tucked away in her creative bubble. Her sketchbook quickly filled with drawings of children laughing, a dog chasing a frisbee, and a family setting up a picnic. Art was her way of making sense of the world, a lens through which she captured its beauty in chaos. She was so engrossed in her sketching that she didn't notice the patrol car pull up by the park's entrance. Officer Ryan Holman stepped out, adjusting his belt as his eyes scanned the scene. He was a seasoned officer, known among his colleagues for his no-nonsense attitude, but his reputation in the community was less favorable. Stories of his abrasive demeanor, particularly toward minorities, had circulated for years, though complaints never seemed to stick. Ryan Holman carried himself with an air of authority that bordered on arrogance. For him, the badge wasn't just a symbol of law enforcement, it was a shield that allowed him to act without consequence. As he walked through the park, his sharp eyes darted from group to group, searching for any hint of disorder. To him, disorder was not defined by actual lawbreaking but by who he believed didn't belong. His gaze settled on Tasha. She was alone, quiet, and immersed in her sketchbook. To Holman, her very presence under that tree was enough to warrant suspicion. He didn't see a child lost in her art. He saw something else entirely, an easy target. Tasha's pencil paused as a shadow fell over her sketchbook. She looked up, startled to find the officer standing in front of her. His towering frame blocked out the sun, and his expression was unreadable. "Can I help you?" Tasha asked, her voice polite but cautious. "What are you doing here?" Holman's tone was sharp, his words less a question and more an accusation. Tasha blinked, confused. I'm just drawing. Drawing, huh? He tilted his head, eyes narrowing as if trying to find something wrong with her answer. Where are your parents? At home, she said, her fingers tightening on the edges of her sketchbook. I come here all the time. That so? He glanced at the backpack beside her, as though it held evidence of some crime. You don't look like you belong here. Tasha's stomach tightened. She didn't know what he meant, but his tone made her uneasy. I'm not doing anything wrong, she said softly, her voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling inside her. Holman smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. Maybe not yet. The interaction drew the attention of other parkgoers. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd as people noticed the uniformed officer standing over a young girl. Tasha's friends, a group of kids her age playing soccer nearby, stopped their game to watch, unsure whether to intervene. Stand up, Holman barked, his voice loud enough to make Tasha flinch. She hesitated, clutching her sketchbook tighter. Why? Because I said so, he snapped, leaning closer. You got a problem with following instructions? Tasha stood slowly, her small frame dwarfed by his imposing presence. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she met his gaze, refusing to look away. That's better, Holman said, his smirk returning. He pulled a cigarette from his pocket and lit it, taking a slow drag as his eyes lingered on her. You need to learn some respect. Tasha's friends whispered urgently among themselves, one of them pulling out a phone to record the interaction. The tension in the park was palpable, the weight of it pressing down on everyone who watched but didn't know how to act. Holman took another drag from his cigarette and exhaled the smoke deliberately. He lowered the burning tip toward Tasha's arm, his movements slow, deliberate, as if daring her to react. Stop, she cried, stumbling back as the ember's heat brushed against her skin. Her voice cracked, tears stinging her eyes as she clutched her arm. The humiliation burned more than the pain. Get your hands off her, a voice boomed, cutting through the scene like a thunderclap. All heads turned to see a man striding toward them, his sharp suit and fierce expression making him impossible to ignore. David Bennett didn't need to ask what had happened. The look on Tasha's face and the officer's smug demeanor told him everything he needed to know. His fury was controlled but unmistakable, radiating from every step as he closed the distance. What the hell is going on here? David demanded, his voice firm and unwavering. Holman straightened, his smirk faltering for the first time. Sir, you were just assaulting my daughter, David cut him off, his voice rising. He stepped between Holman and Tasha, shielding her with his body. She's a child. And you, what are you? A coward hiding behind a badge? Tasha clung to her father's arm, her tears now mixed with relief. She had never seen him like this before, so fierce, so unyielding. The crowd began to murmur, their whispers growing louder as more people pulled out their phones to record the confrontation. Holman's confidence wavered, his eyes darting between David and the onlookers. You've done enough, David said, his voice like ice. But believe me, this isn't over. Not by a long shot. Holman's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his arrogance replaced by unease. David turned to Tasha, his voice softening. Are you okay? She nodded, though her lips trembled. I didn't do anything wrong, she whispered. I know, he said, his expression fierce but filled with reassurance. And we're going to make sure everyone else knows it too. As the crowd buzzed with anger and curiosity, one question lingered in the air: what would happen next? The car ride home was quiet, the silence heavy with unsaid words. Tasha sat in the passenger seat, her arms wrapped tightly around her sketchbook. She hadn't let go of it since they left the park. Her father, David, gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the leather. His jaw was clenched, his eyes focused on the road, though the tension radiating off him made it clear his thoughts were far from the traffic ahead. You're not hurt, are you? He asked finally, his voice calm but laced with an edge of worry. Tasha shook her head, though the faint red mark on her arm still throbbed. "I'm okay," she said softly, her voice barely audible. But David heard the crack in her words, the tremor of lingering fear. "You shouldn't have to say that," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "You shouldn't have to be okay with what happened. Because it shouldn't have happened." Tasha stared down at her lap, her fingers tightening around her sketchbook. She wanted to say something, to reassure him, to share how she felt, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she let the quiet return, though it was far from peaceful. When they pulled into the driveway, David turned off the engine but didn't get out. He sat there for a moment, the weight of what had happened pressing down on him. "Listen," he said, finally breaking the silence. "I'm going to handle this. What that man did to you, it won't go unanswered." Tasha looked up at him, her eyes wide and uncertain. "What can you do?" she asked. "He's a cop. They'll just say he was doing his job." David's expression hardened. "That wasn't his job," he said firmly. "And he doesn't get to hide behind that excuse. Not this time." Inside the house, Angela was waiting. She had woken up from her nap to find Tasha's friends blowing up her phone with videos and messages about what had happened at the park. As soon as the door opened, she rushed to them, her eyes scanning Tasha for signs of injury. "Oh my God," Angela breathed, kneeling in front of her daughter. "Are you hurt? Let me see." Her hands fluttered around Tasha's arms, her panic barely contained. "I'm okay, Mom," Tasha said again, though the words felt hollow now. Angela's gaze flicked to David, her worry quickly morphing into anger. "What happened?" David took a deep breath, recounting the events in a measured tone, though the anger simmering beneath his words was unmistakable. Angela listened, her expression growing darker with every detail. "He did what?" she said, her voice rising. "He burned her. In front of everyone." "I'm taking care of it," David said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Taking care of it how?" Angela demanded. "Because that man doesn't deserve to just walk away from this. He humiliated our daughter." David met her gaze, his eyes steady. "He won't walk away. I promise you that." Tasha watched them, her parents' fierce love for her both comforting and overwhelming. She felt a lump rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down, unwilling to let the tears fall. Later that night, David sat at his desk, his laptop open in front of him. He had already downloaded the videos from the park, sent messages to colleagues, and begun drafting a formal complaint against the officer. But this wasn't just about filing paperwork. David knew the system too well. He knew how often complaints were dismissed, how easily officers like Holman escaped accountability. This time, it had to be different. Angela entered the room, her arms crossed. "You're not just filing a report, are you?" she asked, her voice calm but piercing. David didn't look up. "Of course not." She nodded, though her worry lingered. "Do you think they'll take it seriously?" "They'll have to," David said, his tone firm. "I'll make sure they do." The next morning, David called Tasha into the living room. Angela was there too, her presence a quiet pillar of support. David explained what he was going to do, that they were going to hold Holman accountable, not just for what he did to Tasha but for every abuse of power he had gotten away with. "I need you to be brave," David said, looking directly at Tasha. "Because this might get messy. They're going to try to make it seem like it was your fault, like you did something wrong. But you didn't. You did nothing wrong." Tasha nodded, though her heart pounded at the thought of facing more scrutiny. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. As the days went on, the case began to take shape. David reached out to community leaders, local activists, and families who had similar stories about Holman. What started as a single complaint turned into a growing movement, with more and more people coming forward to share their experiences. The local media picked up the story, and soon Tasha found herself at the center of a storm. Reporters called, asking for interviews, while social media exploded with posts about the incident. Support poured in from strangers, but so did hateful comments from those defending Holman. At school, Tasha felt the weight of the attention. Some kids avoided her, while others whispered behind her back. But there were also those who stood by her, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Her art teacher, Mrs. Harper, even set up a small exhibition of her sketches in the hallway, a quiet show of support that made Tasha smile despite everything. Meanwhile, Holman was facing pressure of his own. The videos from the park had gone viral, and public outcry was growing. He was placed on administrative leave, but his defiance remained. In a brief interview with a local news station, he dismissed the allegations as overblown and claimed he had been doing his job. David watched the interview with a grim expression. "He's scared," he said, though his tone was more resolute than triumphant. "He knows what's coming." Angela frowned. "Do you think he'll fight back?" "Of course he will," David said. "But he doesn't have the truth on his side." "We do." As the case moved closer to a formal hearing, tensions continued to rise. Holman's legal team began spreading rumors, trying to discredit Tasha and her family. They pointed to her age, her quiet demeanor, twisting it into a narrative of rebellion. They painted David as a vengeful attorney exploiting the situation for personal gain. But David refused to be rattled. He prepared meticulously, his arguments sharp and his evidence irrefutable. He knew the stakes were high, not just for his family, but for every family that had ever been silenced by the weight of injustice. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, Tasha looked at her parents. "Do you think we'll win?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with hope. David smiled, his expression both gentle and determined. "It's not just about winning," he said. "It's about doing what's right. And as long as we do that, we've already won." Angela reached over and squeezed Tasha's hand. "We believe in you," she said. "And we believe in us." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the warmth of their unity a stark contrast to the storm brewing outside. But even as they found solace in each other, the weight of what was to come lingered in the air. The hearing was approaching. The evidence was ready. The witnesses were prepared. And David knew that the moment of reckoning was drawing near. What he didn't know was just how far Holman would go to defend himself, and just how much would be revealed when the truth finally came to light. The courtroom was packed. Every seat in the gallery was taken, and the walls were lined with people who had squeezed in, hoping to witness what had become one of the most high-profile cases in the city. Cameras flashed outside, muffled voices of reporters trying to get updates filtered through the heavy oak doors. Inside, there was a tense quiet, as if the air itself was bracing for what was to come. Tasha sat between her parents, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She glanced up at her father, David, who was leafing through his notes, his face calm but focused. This wasn't just another case for him. This was his family, his daughter, and he carried that weight with every word he prepared to say. Across the room sat Officer Ryan Holman. His uniform was gone, replaced by a stiff suit that did little to soften his sharp, unyielding features. He leaned back in his chair, his lawyer whispering something in his ear. He didn't seem rattled. If anything, the faint smirk on his lips suggested he still believed he would walk out unscathed. The judge entered, and everyone rose. The proceedings began with the usual formalities, but the atmosphere remained electric. The prosecution laid out their case first, presenting the videos from the park, witness statements, and Tasha's account of the incident. Each piece of evidence chipped away at the armor Holman had carefully constructed over the years. When it was David's turn to speak, he stood slowly, his presence commanding the room. He wasn't just a father fighting for his daughter, he was a seasoned attorney who knew how to use every moment to his advantage. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "this is not just about one man's actions on one day. It's about a pattern of abuse, humiliation, and unchecked power. Officer Holman didn't see my daughter as a child that day. He saw her as less than human, and he acted accordingly. The room was silent, every word hanging in the air. David turned to the jury, his eyes locking onto each member as he spoke. But the truth has a way of catching up with people like Officer Holman. Because this time, there were witnesses. This time, there were cameras. And this time, there will be accountability. As David sat down, Tasha felt a surge of pride. Her father's words carried a conviction that was impossible to ignore. But as the defense prepared to respond, a knot tightened in her stomach. She knew they would try to twist the truth, to make her feel small again. Holman's lawyer, a slick man with a polished demeanor, stood and approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone almost condescending, "what we have here is a misunderstanding. My client, Officer Holman, has served this community for over a decade. He was doing his job that day, ensuring the safety of everyone in the park." Tasha's jaw tightened as the lawyer continued, painting Holman as a dedicated officer who had been unfairly vilified. "The videos you've seen," the lawyer said, gesturing toward the screen where the clips had played earlier, "only tell part of the story. My client acted in the interest of public safety, responding to what he believed was suspicious behavior." David shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor." "Speculation." The judge nodded. "Sustained." "Counselor, stick to the facts." The lawyer gave a tight smile but continued, undeterred. "The fact remains that Officer Holman has an exemplary record. One incident, blown out of proportion, should not define his entire career." Tasha looked down at her hands, her nails digging into her palms. She felt anger bubbling inside her, a fire she hadn't been able to express until now. She glanced at her father, who gave her a reassuring nod, as if to say, "Hold on. We're not done yet." The defense called Holman to the stand. He walked up confidently, his posture straight, his expression neutral. But as he began to speak, cracks in his composure started to show. "I was patrolling the park," he said, his voice measured. "I noticed a group of kids causing a disturbance." David's eyebrows raised slightly. "Disturbance," he whispered to Angela, who shook her head, incredulous. Holman continued, describing Tasha's behavior in vague terms that didn't align with the videos. "I approached the girl to ask her some questions. She became defensive, and I may have overreacted. But it wasn't malicious." David stood when it was his turn for cross-examination, his steps deliberate as he approached the stand. "Officer Holman," he began, his voice steady but sharp, "you said my daughter was causing a disturbance. Could you clarify exactly what she was doing?" Holman hesitated, his eyes flickering to his lawyer. "She was sitting alone. Drawing, I think." David raised an eyebrow. "Drawing. And that struck you as suspicious?" "I wasn't sure what she was doing," Holman replied, his tone defensive. "It's my job to investigate anything unusual." "Unusual," David repeated, letting the word linger. "So, a 13-year-old girl sitting in a park with a sketchbook struck you as unusual? Or was it the color of her skin that caught your attention?" A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Holman stiffened. "That's not what I'm saying." "But it's what you did," David pressed, his voice growing firmer. "You targeted her. You humiliated her. And when she didn't react the way you wanted, you assaulted her. Isn't that correct?" "No," Holman said quickly, but his voice wavered. David stepped closer, his tone cutting through Holman's weak denial. "Let's talk about the cigarette, Officer Holman. You claim it was an accident. But the video shows you holding it deliberately close to her arm. Why?" Holman opened his mouth but no words came out. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on him. David seized the moment. "You abused your power," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "And now, you're trying to hide behind excuses. But the evidence is clear. You didn't see a child that day. You saw someone you thought you could intimidate. Someone you thought wouldn't fight back. Well, you were wrong. As David returned to his seat, Tasha felt a swell of emotion she couldn't contain. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was part of something bigger, a fight for justice, for herself, and for everyone who had ever been silenced. The judge called for a recess, but the tension in the room didn't dissipate. Holman sat stiffly at the defense table, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. David leaned over to Tasha, his voice soft but firm. "We're not finished yet," he said. "But this is where things start to change." And as Tasha looked around the room, at the faces of the jury, the reporters, and the onlookers, she felt a spark of hope. The truth was finally coming to light, and nothing, not even Holman's badge, could shield him from what was coming next. The courtroom reconvened after the brief recess, and the air was thicker with tension than before. David could feel the weight of every gaze, but he remained composed, meticulously scanning his notes. Across the room, Officer Holman sat rigidly, his lawyer leaning in close, whispering furiously. The smirk Holman had carried earlier was gone now, replaced by a mask of unease. The judge's gavel brought the room to order. "Prosecution, you may proceed." David stood, his movements deliberate. "Your Honor," he began, addressing the court with a calm authority, "I'd like to call a rebuttal witness to the stand." The defense lawyer's head snapped up. "Objection. This witness wasn't disclosed during discovery." David turned to the judge, his tone unwavering. "Your Honor, this witness came forward after initial proceedings began. Their testimony is directly relevant to this case and addresses new evidence that has come to light." The judge studied David for a moment, then nodded. "I'll allow it. Proceed." From the back of the courtroom, a man rose. He was older, with graying hair and a slight limp, dressed in a worn suit that contrasted sharply with the polished appearance of Holman's lawyer. As he made his way to the stand, whispers rippled through the gallery. "Please state your name for the court," David said once the man was sworn in. "Gerald Turner," the man replied, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "And your relationship to this case?" David asked. "I was a police officer in this department for over 20 years, Turner said, his eyes fixed on Holman. "I worked alongside Officer Holman." Holman's lawyer shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. Mr. Turner's testimony has no bearing on the events at the park." David's gaze didn't waver. "Your Honor, Mr. Turner's testimony will establish a pattern of behavior by Officer Holman that is critical to understanding his actions that day." The judge considered for a moment before gesturing for David to continue. "I'll allow it. But tread carefully, Mr. Bennett." David nodded, turning back to Turner. "Mr. Turner, you stated that you worked with Officer Holman. Can you describe your experience with him?" Turner's expression tightened. "Holman, he wasn't like most officers. From the beginning, he had a way of targeting certain people. It wasn't about enforcing the law, it was about power. He'd single out kids, people who couldn't fight back." There was an audible gasp from the gallery. David pressed forward. "Did you ever report this behavior?" Turner hesitated, his voice heavy with regret. "I tried. A couple of times. But nothing ever came of it. The department covered for him. Said it was just him being thorough." David's eyes sharpened. "And what about this incident? What made you decide to come forward now?" Turner shifted in his seat, his gaze dropping for a moment before he looked back up. "Because I saw that video. That girl, what he did to her reminded me of the other times he crossed the line. And I couldn't stay silent anymore." David nodded, his voice steady. "Thank you, Mr. Turner. No further questions." The defense lawyer stood quickly, his tone sharp as he began his cross-examination. "Mr. Turner, isn't it true that you retired under less than ideal circumstances?" That there were allegations of misconduct against you? Turner's jaw tightened. There were accusations, yes. None of them were proven. But you're no longer an officer, correct? The lawyer pressed. And yet you expect this court to take your word over that of my client, a decorated officer with years of service? Turner didn't flinch. I expect this court to see the truth, he said simply. The defense lawyer sneered but backed off, sensing he wasn't gaining ground. No further questions, Your Honor. As Turner stepped down, David's mind raced. Turner's testimony had been a gamble, but it was clear the jury was paying attention. Still, he needed something more, something undeniable. Your Honor, David said, stepping forward again, the prosecution would like to enter new video evidence into the record. Holman's lawyer was on his feet instantly. Objection. This is ambush litigation. David didn't blink. Your Honor, the defense was made aware of this video yesterday. They've had ample time to review it. The judge frowned, then gestured for David to proceed. Let's see it. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. The gallery leaned forward, everyone riveted. The footage was grainy but clear enough. It showed Holman in a different park, confronting a young boy. His tone was hostile, his posture aggressive. The boy, no older than Tasha, stood frozen as Holman towered over him, shouting accusations. Then came the moment that silenced the entire courtroom, Holman grabbing the boy's arm, twisting it painfully, and muttering something under his breath. The video ended, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. Where did you get that? Holman's lawyer demanded, his voice rising. David remained calm. A brave member of the community came forward. This video was taken just last year. Holman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his face pale. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions grim. David turned to the judge. Your Honor, this video corroborates a pattern of behavior by the defendant. This isn't about one isolated incident. It's about an abuse of power that has gone unchecked for too long. The judge nodded, her expression unreadable. The jury will take it into consideration. As the trial continued, David pressed every advantage, his arguments sharp and unrelenting. Holman's defense began to falter, their polished narrative crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Tasha watched as her father dismantled every excuse, every lie, piece by piece. When closing arguments began, David stood once more, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This case is about more than what happened to my daughter, he said, his eyes sweeping the jury. It's about accountability. About ensuring that those who are entrusted to protect us are held to the highest standard. Officer Holman failed that standard. And he should face the consequences. The defense lawyer tried to salvage what was left, but it was clear their momentum was gone. When the judge dismissed the jury to deliberate, the tension in the room was almost unbearable. Hours passed. Tasha sat between her parents, her heart pounding with every passing minute. Finally, the jury returned, their faces serious as they filed back into the courtroom. The foreperson stood, holding a piece of paper. We, the jury, find the defendant. The room seemed to hold its breath. What came next would change everything. The foreperson's voice rang out, steady and clear. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ryan Holman, guilty of misconduct in office, excessive use of force, and assault. The words sent a ripple through the courtroom. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few quiet cheers echoed from the gallery, but the judge's gavel quickly silenced them. Tasha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her fingers trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. Beside her, David leaned back slightly, his expression a mix of relief and satisfaction, though his eyes remained sharp, still calculating. Angela reached over to squeeze Tasha's hand, her silent gesture speaking volumes. On the other side of the room, Holman's face hardened. His lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously, but Holman didn't respond. His gaze was fixed forward, his jaw clenched as though sheer force of will could reverse the outcome. The judge spoke, her tone firm but measured. "Officer Holman, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks. Until then, you are remanded into custody." The bailiff stepped forward, and for the first time, Holman's mask cracked. His eyes darted around the room, landing briefly on David and Tasha before looking away. The faint smirk he had worn throughout the trial was gone, replaced by something far more raw, fear. As he was escorted out, the courtroom erupted into a flurry of activity. David turned to Tasha, his expression softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low. She nodded, but her lips trembled. "I think so." Angela pulled her into a hug, whispering, "You were so brave." For the first time in weeks, Tasha let herself relax, her head resting on her mother's shoulder. But even as relief washed over her, a nagging thought lingered in the back of her mind: what now? Outside the courthouse, reporters and activists swarmed the steps, cameras flashing and microphones jostling for space. David shielded Tasha as they made their way through the crowd, Angela keeping a firm grip on her hand. Questions flew at them from every direction. "Mr. Bennett, how do you feel about the verdict? Do you think justice was served? Tasha, what would you say to Officer Holman if you could speak to him?" David paused at the base of the steps, turning to face the reporters. His voice was calm but firm, every word deliberate. "This verdict is a step forward, not just for my family, but for every family that has faced injustice. But our work isn't done. This isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that allows abuse of power to thrive. We'll continue to fight for accountability, for reform, and for justice." Tasha watched as her father spoke, his voice cutting through the noise like a beacon. She felt a swell of pride, but also an overwhelming sense of responsibility. The world was watching them now, and with that came pressure she hadn't anticipated. As they finally broke free from the crowd and climbed into the car, the silence felt both comforting and heavy. Angela was the first to speak. "You were incredible, David," she said, her tone filled with admiration. "But, what's next?" David exhaled, resting his hands on the steering wheel for a moment before answering. "Next, we make sure the sentencing reflects the gravity of what he's done. And we keep pushing for change. This can't just be about one man going to prison." Tasha looked out the window, the city blurring past as they drove home. "Do you think he feels sorry?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. David glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whether he does or not, it's not up to us to carry that burden. What matters is that we've made it harder for him to hurt anyone else." At home, the phone rang incessantly, friends, family, even strangers wanting to offer their support or share their own stories of injustice. Angela handled most of the calls, her voice calm and reassuring, while David retreated to his office to sift through emails and prepare for the next steps. Tasha retreated to her room, the quiet a welcome reprieve. She sat on her bed, flipping through her sketchbook. Each drawing felt different now, tinged with the memory of what had happened at the park. She stopped at a page, a quick sketch of the oak tree she had been sitting under that day. Her pencil hovered above it, unsure whether to add more or tear it out altogether. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. David stepped in, holding a mug of hot chocolate. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. She nodded, and he sat on the edge of the bed, handing her the mug. "I know today was a lot," he said gently. "How are you holding up?" "I don't know," she admitted, staring into the swirling steam. "It's weird. I thought I'd feel happier, I guess. But it's like, even though he's going to jail, it doesn't change what he did." David nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. It doesn't. What happened to you was wrong, and nothing can erase that. But what we did today, it made sure he can't do it again. And it showed a lot of people that they don't have to stay silent." That's something. Tasha looked at him, her eyes searching. Do you ever get tired of fighting? Like, don't you ever feel like it's too much? David smiled, though there was a sadness in it. All the time. But then I remember why I'm fighting. I think about you, and your mom, and everyone who deserves to live in a world that's fair and just. And that makes it worth it. She nodded slowly, his words sinking in. Do you think things will actually change? Like, for real? David's smile grew warmer. I think change takes time. But every step we take makes it a little closer. And today, we took a big step. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the day settling between them. Then David reached over and gently closed the sketchbook in her lap. You know, your art has a way of speaking louder than words. Maybe that's how you'll keep fighting. Tasha looked at the closed book, a spark of determination lighting in her chest. Maybe. As the night deepened, the house grew quiet again. But the world outside was anything but. News outlets dissected the trial, social media buzzed with debates, and community leaders used the momentum to push for broader reforms. The verdict had set something in motion, something that felt bigger than any one person. But as Tasha lay in bed, staring at the shadows on her ceiling, one question lingered in her mind. The fight for justice was far from over. What role would she play in it? And could she find her own way to make a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone still waiting to be heard? The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the living room as Tasha sat curled up on the couch. She was scrolling through her phone, watching the countless posts, videos, and articles that had surfaced overnight. Her face was a mix of emotions, pride, disbelief, and something she couldn't quite name. It felt strange to see her own story being dissected by people she had never met, strangers debating her life as if it were just another headline. Angela entered the room, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She sat down beside Tasha, her movements deliberate, as if she didn't want to startle her. You've been quiet all morning, she said gently. What's on your mind? Tasha hesitated, then turned her phone screen toward her mother. It was a video of a protest, a crowd marching down the streets holding signs with messages like justice for Tasha and end police brutality. The chants were loud and passionate, their voices blending into a powerful wave of sound. Is it weird that it feels too much? Tasha asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Like, I didn't ask for all this attention. Angela reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Tasha's face. It's not weird at all, she said softly. You didn't ask for any of this, sweetheart. But you didn't back down, either. That's why people are standing up for you. Because you showed them they can. Tasha bit her lip, her eyes dropping to her lap. What if I don't want to be a symbol? What if I just want to be normal? Angela sighed, pulling her daughter into a side hug. You are normal, Tasha. You're a 13-year-old girl who loves to draw and dream and be herself. But you're also brave. And sometimes, being brave means standing in a spotlight you didn't ask for. Tasha leaned into her mother's embrace, letting the warmth soothe her. It's just a lot, she admitted. Everyone keeps talking about what I represent, but I feel like they don't even know me. Angela nodded, understanding the weight her daughter was carrying. They see what you stood up against, not just for yourself but for everyone who's ever been in your shoes. That's why it's so big. But you don't have to let it define you. You get to decide who you are, Tasha, not them. David's voice came from the doorway, breaking the moment. Your mom's right. He stepped into the room, holding a stack of papers. You don't owe anyone anything, Tasha. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can use their attention to make something good happen. Tasha looked at him, curiosity flickering in her eyes. What do you mean? He sat down in the armchair across from them, setting the papers on the coffee table. There's momentum right now. People are paying attention. If we keep pushing, we can make sure this isn't just another story that fades away. We can fight for real changes, policies, training, accountability. Angela raised an eyebrow. You're thinking of expanding the case, aren't you? David nodded. Holman was just the start. There are others out there, officers, systems, entire structures that need to be addressed. If we can keep the pressure on, we might actually make a difference. Tasha frowned, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the fabric of the couch. But what if nothing changes, she asked. What if it's just talk, and in the end, everything stays the same? David leaned forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. That's always a risk. But if we don't try, we're guaranteeing nothing will change. You've already done something incredible, Tasha. Just by standing up, you've inspired people to act. That's more than most adults can say. Tasha didn't reply immediately, but his words lingered in her mind. She looked at the papers on the table, legal briefs, community petitions, letters of support, and felt a small spark of something she hadn't realized she was missing, hope. Later that afternoon, they gathered around the dining table, discussing their next steps. Angela had been fielding calls from local activists, many of whom wanted to collaborate with David to push for broader reforms. Tasha listened quietly, absorbing the seriousness of the conversation. So, what's the plan? Angela asked, sipping her tea. Are we focusing on policy changes, or are you thinking of taking on more cases? Both, David replied. We've already had 3 families come forward with stories about Holman. If we can build a broader case, it could expose systemic issues within the department. Angela's brow furrowed. Do you think the department will cooperate? They've already been defensive about Holman. They don't have a choice, David said firmly. The public's watching now. They know we're not going away. Tasha spoke up hesitantly, her voice cutting through the room's tension. What about the other kids he hurt? Do they get a say? David's expression softened. Of course they do, he said. We'll make sure their voices are heard. Just like yours. As the conversation continued, Tasha felt herself becoming more invested. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped her for weeks were still there, but now they were joined by a growing sense of purpose. Maybe she couldn't change everything, but she could be part of something bigger. That evening, Tasha sat at her desk, her sketchbook open in front of her. For the first time since the trial began, she felt inspired to draw again. Her pencil moved across the page, forming the outline of a crowd, a diverse group of people standing together, their faces determined, their hands raised in unity. In the center of the crowd was a young girl, her face tilted upward, her expression strong and resolute. She smiled faintly, the image reflecting the strength she was beginning to feel. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or pushed aside. And maybe, just maybe, she could help give them a voice. Downstairs, David was on the phone with a local journalist, arranging an interview to discuss the next steps for the case. Angela was drafting an open letter to the mayor, calling for an independent review of the police department. The house buzzed with quiet determination, each member of the family finding their own way to contribute. As the night deepened, Tasha stood by her window, looking out at the city lights. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were moving forward. And that, she realized, was enough for now. The sentencing hearing was held in the same courtroom where the trial had taken place. This time, the gallery was even more crowded. Community leaders, families who had suffered similar abuses, and a sea of supporters had come to witness the conclusion of a case that had become a symbol of accountability. The media had positioned themselves outside, broadcasting every update. Tasha sat with her parents in the front row. She was calm, her hands resting on her lap, her posture straight. In the weeks since the verdict, she had grown into a quiet strength. She wasn't the same girl who had been humiliated in the park. She had found her voice, and with it, a purpose that resonated far beyond her own experience. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Holman was led in, his once arrogant demeanor replaced by a stiffness that bordered on resignation. He avoided looking at the gallery, his focus fixed on the table in front of him. His lawyer whispered to him, but he barely acknowledged it. The judge began, her tone steady but firm. "Officer Holman, this court has considered the evidence, the testimony, and the harm caused by your actions. Your abuse of power was not only a violation of the law but a betrayal of the trust placed in you by this community. Your sentence will reflect the severity of your actions." The gallery held its collective breath as she read the sentence: 10 years in prison, loss of his pension, and permanent disqualification from serving in any law enforcement capacity. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room, a mixture of relief and quiet celebration. Tasha's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Holman's reaction. He flinched but said nothing. His lawyer leaned over, whispering again, but Holman remained motionless, staring ahead. For a moment, Tasha almost felt pity for him. But then she remembered the smirk on his face that day in the park, the way he had used his power to make her feel small. That memory extinguished any lingering sympathy. As Holman was escorted out, David turned to Tasha. "It's over," he said softly, his voice filled with both relief and pride. Tasha nodded, her eyes glistening. "It's not just about him anymore, though," she said. "There's still so much to do." David smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "And we'll do it. Together." In the weeks that followed, the momentum from the case only grew. The families who had come forward during the trial banded together with David, forming a coalition to push for systemic reform. They organized town halls, met with city officials, and demanded transparency from the police department. The community, galvanized by Tasha's courage, rallied behind them. Tasha herself became an unexpected symbol of resilience. Her story was featured in national media, and her sketches, now filled with images of hope and unity, were displayed at a local gallery as part of a fundraiser for the coalition. At first, she felt overwhelmed by the attention, but as she stood among the crowd at the opening, she realized something important: her art was a way to speak, not just for herself, but for others who still felt silenced. Angela found her own way to contribute. She spearheaded a program at her hospital to provide free mental health resources to families affected by racial trauma. Her calm determination and deep empathy made her a natural leader, and she quickly became a trusted figure in the movement. David, ever the strategist, expanded his work beyond the local level. With the support of the coalition, he filed a civil lawsuit against the city, aiming to hold not just Holman but the entire department accountable for its failures. The lawsuit gained national attention, putting even more pressure on city leaders to implement lasting changes. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Tasha looked at her parents. "Do you think it's really working?" she asked, her voice thoughtful. Angela reached across the table, taking her daughter's hand. "It already is," she said. "Look at everything that's happened. People are listening. Change takes time, but it's happening." David nodded in agreement. "The most important thing is that we don't stop. And we won't." Months later, the coalition celebrated its first major victory. The city council passed a series of reforms, including mandatory bias training for officers, independent oversight of the police department, and the creation of a community advisory board. It wasn't everything they wanted, but it was a start. Tasha stood in the crowd at the press conference, listening as her father spoke about the importance of continuing the fight. She felt a sense of pride, not just in him, but in herself. She had faced something terrible and come out stronger. And now, she was part of something bigger than herself, a movement that was changing the world. That night, as she sat in her room, Tasha opened her sketchbook. She began to draw, her pencil moving with purpose. The image took shape slowly, a young girl standing beneath a tall oak tree, her head held high, surrounded by a crowd of people holding signs. Above the tree, the words, "Justice is growing," were written in bold letters. She smiled, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't realized she needed. To everyone who has listened to this story, let's take a moment to reflect. Tasha's journey wasn't just about one act of injustice. It was about finding the strength to stand up, the courage to speak out, and the determination to create change. Her story reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming challenges, we have the power to make a difference, not just for ourselves, but for others as well. What about you? Have you ever witnessed or experienced something that made you question what's fair, what's right? What would you do if you were in Tasha's shoes, or David's, or even Angela's? Share your thoughts in the comments, we want to hear your voice. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist. We're here to share stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us all of the power of resilience and hope. Thanks for being part of this journey. See you in the next story.